Welcome to Intelligence Gathering. I'm Horit, and I'll be the facilitator for this module. We're currently at Unit 1, and to start things off, let us have a brief look at what intelligence gathering is all about. Before we do that, however, there are some definitions that we want to get out of the way. Namely, what is the distinction between information and intelligence? When we talk about information, we're talking about data that is not processed. In other words, we're just looking at the facts. And when we're talking about intelligence, having the facts is going to be very, very important for us, because if we are going to make decisions, then we must be making decisions based on an accurate observation of reality. So information is data, but it is data that has not yet been processed, whereas intelligence is going to be data that has been analyzed, it has been processed, and by virtue of this processing, it now conveys meaning so that we can make effective decisions within organizations. And if you have a look at the diagram that we have here, it kind of depicts the distinction between information and intelligence. As we mentioned earlier, information has to do with facts. So all of these data points that we see here are representing the facts. But just having the data by itself is not going to be enough. We must now make the connections between the data so that we can have a true appreciation of what the data is telling us. And in so doing, we end up with intelligence. Now, there are different types of intelligence, and the module really looks at four. It looks at open source intelligence, human intelligence, geospatial intelligence, and cyber intelligence. The graphic below, though, kind of shows that open source intelligence is really an umbrella term that covers various types of intelligence. So, for example, we're saying here that human intelligence is subsumed under open source intelligence. We're also saying that geointelligence is also subsumed under open source intelligence. So it begs the question, what is open source intelligence? And open source intelligence is going to be information that we gather from public sources. And by virtue of gathering this information, we then process it so that we can get meaning out of it. So what are some of the public sources that we're talking about? We're talking about like the news media. We're talking about using search engines like Google. We're talking about looking at social networks like a Facebook, TikTok. These are sources that are publicly available, and we can go through these sources in order to obtain information that we can use to create intelligence. We also have human intelligence, as was mentioned earlier, and this is where we are getting the information from human sources. So we can speak to people, casually, or we can interview them in a formal manner. We can also use observation. For example, we go into a bank and we realize that there's a keypad that is being used to provide access to a particular place. Just by observing, you might be able to see the pattern that is being used to enter into that space. And that is why we have to be very, very cautious when we are in organization, when we are in public spaces, as to how we comport ourselves. Because something as seemingly secure, and secure is in quotes here, as a keypad where we are entering digits to access somewhere, can be giving persons who are keen observers an idea as to how to get into spaces that they are not supposed to be in. We're also looking at geointelligence, where we're using geographic data so that we can get information about location. And you know that whenever a photograph is taken, and most of these smartphones, it is pinned in terms of the location. So we can use images and get information as to where this was taken in terms of longitude and latitude. So once again, it behooves us to be extremely important in terms of the kind of information that we put out there on social media. And then we have cyber intelligence, where we're looking at information related to threats that are going to be observed with regards to the network that we are on. We're also talking about vulnerabilities, intrusions, how cyber criminals are going to operate within the space, what kind of information they are looking for, and things like that. So once again, as cyber professionals, we have to be concerned about the kind of data that is out there, because we are interested in that data so that we can gain intelligence. And we're also interested about or concerned about the kind of data that we are putting out there, because we don't want persons to be able to track us um, without our knowledge. So the other thing that is important is to have an appreciation of the key stakeholders when we're talking about cybersecurity. So yes, we're talking about open source intelligence, but as cyber professionals, we are very, very interested in cybersecurity. And we're saying here that there are a few stakeholders which are important: government agencies, private sector, cybersecurity professionals, international organizations, and obviously the individual users. And the graphic over here, I think, is a bit illustrative of what it is we are saying here, because we want to ensure that there is partnership between the public and the private sector. It is in the strength of these partnerships or relationships that we are better able to secure our digital assets. So why do we need government agencies on the list in terms of stakeholders? Well, bear in mind that the politicians are the ones who make recommendations for laws. And this is important because we need a strong regulatory body. If it is, we are going to be safe in terms of the cyberspace. We're also talking about the judiciary, because we need the lawyers to be on board so that due process can be observed whenever things are going wrong from a legal perspective. We're also going to need law enforcement officials who are able to go out there and investigate breaches and take in persons who are found to be in breach so that they can be duly processed by the legal system. We're also talking about relevant ministries. For example, ministries that deal with technology, ministry that deal with economy, the financial services. And also we're talking about education, because once again, education is going to be very, very important if it is we are going to secure our digital assets. You know, security is everybody's business. And if security is everybody's business, then for us to be very, very strong in terms of security, then everybody needs to have the knowledge base that is important so that they are better able to comport themselves within the digital space. So what about private sector organizations? Well, we are going to need technology companies to set up the infrastructure. So we're talking about companies like Digicel, like Flow. And as these companies set up the infrastructure, we want them to set up the infrastructure so in such a way so that security is at the forefront of whatever it is that they are doing. So when we are making calls, when we are sending information, we want to be sure that they have the necessary things in place to offer the kind of security that we need. If we talk about WhatsApp, for example, which is a company within the private sector space, albeit overseas, they are telling us that whenever we are communicating from point to point, there is end-to-end encryption. So these are some of the things that are necessary, which are required by the technology companies if we are going to be kept safe. We're also talking about companies who deal with things like security. So we're talking about like a Microsoft, like Fortinet. These are going to be companies that have this security stack, which are essential for safeguarding a lot of these digital assets like our networks and so on. And we can't forget the large corporations, corporations like a D&G, like a Grace, like a Lasco, because these are going to be the companies who, number one, they have the financial resources, which can help us in terms of education of the population, which can help us in terms of providing support for the kind of equipment that we might need so that our population can be better trained. So these large corporations play a critical role in terms of safeguarding the security posture of organization and of the country on a whole. Additionally, these are the companies that are likely to be experiencing attacks. And if we are going to be safe, then we need to understand what kind of attacks are being leveraged at our companies on a daily basis. And it is by having this rich partnership with them that they would be able to share these kind of data points with us so that persons who are in academia and so on can do research so that we can new tools, new ways of protecting what we have. Which brings us to the cybersecurity professionals who are taken from both the public and private sector, as well as from academia. So these are going to be the persons within the space who have the necessary expertise to protect the digital assets. And we are saying that there has to be communication between them so that this kind of information can be shared so we know what is happening within the space and are better able to protect ourselves against such. No, we cannot leave out the international organizations because these are the organizations that tend to set the standards. So we're talking about things like NIST. We're talking, I think, about organizations like the ISO. So you would know that there are different standards. For example, whenever we're talking about networks or we're talking about Wi-Fi, there are particular standards which have been put forward by these international organizations and which we should at a bare minimum be in compliance with. We're also talking about things like data protection. And as you know, here in Jamaica, we have our Data Protection Act. But this is not in isolation because long before this, we had the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which was put forward and has been operating in the European region for quite some time. So we have taken from these bodies the information that is pertinent, and we are saying that right here in Jamaica, we now want to be able to leverage this kind of information, put regulations in place so that as a country we can be safe. And finally, I had mentioned this earlier, we're talking about the individual users, the workers within organizations, talking about students who are on campus or within the schools. Because even with this, bring your own device to whether it be to the school place, to the workplace, etc. These are not going to be points of potential attacks. And so the individual users need to be better equipped in terms of how do they comport themselves? How do they safeguard themselves so that when they hop onto the network within the organizations are not suddenly breached because of unresolved security protocols. which are on these particular devices. So we all play a role in terms of safeguarding digital assets. And finally, for Unit 1, we want to have a look at the ethical and legal consideration. So when we talk about ethical considerations, we're talking about things such as the respect for privacy. So individuals need to be sure that their data is private. And that's one of the reasons why the Data Protection Act is so important, because it tells us how to treat information that can identify persons, things like passwords, things like our IDs, things like our name, our date of birth. Those kind of information, they should be treated in a secure manner. And so the Data Protection Act speaks to that. Another thing that is important when we're dealing with ethics is we should always ensure that we are using the accurate and reliable sources in terms of getting the information that we need. What we don't want to do is to get information from spurious sources and we use this information as if it's the gospel, and then we malign individuals. Matter of fact, if we do this, then we can set up ourselves for being sued. So it is important that we ensure that the sources that we're getting the information from is actually accurate. Just the other day, on All Angles, I think it was, there was some information that was said. And, the host had to come back and kind of clarify what was said so as not to put out any misrepresentation out there in the public space. So we have to be very, very careful of that. So when we're talking about accurate and reliable sources, we are saying that we need to check the sources. It's not all news media is accurate news media or credible news media. And even more so now in this age of social media, where every blogger and vlogger is out there giving news, we have to be very, very careful where we're getting the information from. So we have to vet the sources. We have to ensure that where we're getting the information from, these are credible sources. They have demonstrated themselves over time. We're also talking about the fact that there needs to be compliance with laws and regulations. This also speaks to ethics. We need to comply. So if it is that there are particular sources where we can get the information from and particular sources where we are not supposed to be getting the information, then just out of ethical consideration, we want to stick with that are within the ambit of the law, which carries us to the legal aspects. We want to ensure that whatever we are doing comports with the legal stipulations or regulations of the country. So if it is that we need to get particular information and the obtaining of this information requires a warrant, then it means that we need to ensure that the appropriate warrants are obtained through the legal channels so that we can go and obtain the information. Then there's also protecting classified information. We know that information can have several levels within the hierarchy. And so information that is classified should be treated as such. And yes, I know we have the whistleblower clause and so on, but these are exceptions to the rules where in the best interest of public safety, individuals may come out with private information or proprietary information because they're trying to serve the public good. But this has to be treated carefully, delicately. So I'm just saying that there are a few ways in which we can step outside of the boundaries of the law without and probably I shouldn't even say outside the boundaries of the law, but we are able to kind of circumvent the regulations that exist because there is something else in place that gives us the ability to do so. In terms of surveillance as well, we need to ensure that whatever laws are set up governing surveillance, we need to abide by those. And obviously, of course, we want to respect international laws. As a country, we have to keep our eyes on the global space. And so whatever we do here in Jamaica, we want to ensure that it complies with international law so that we are better able to move across boundaries. So what about disinformation? Well, before we talk about disinformation, let's kind of just look at the difference between misinformation and disinformation. And as the image points out here, with misinformation, you are led to believe that something is true, but it is not true. Whereas with disinformation, you know that this thing is not true, but you still share it anyway because you really have an intent to deceive. And so there are a lot of persons out there who major in disinformation. They are saying things that they know blatantly are untrue, but they are saying it because they want to put forward a particular narrative. And the question then becomes, how do we spot these things, whether it is disinformation or misinformation? What are some of the techniques that we can use to identify when things are going haywire and take the necessary actions that need to be taken? And some of these things we have said before. One of them is we always check the source and verify the facts. So verify always. We spoke about earlier why it is important to ensure that the sources of the data is good. So that's one. Secondly, we can look for inconsistencies. So the inconsistencies can be in terms of speech. It can be in terms of images. So we can look at images, for example, and the logo might look wrong. And because the logo look wrong, we know that this is not coming from an accurate place. Or the logo can look altered. So for example, something is coming out from the Met Office. But when we look closely, we realize that the logo for the Met Office seems to be altered, or it seems to be pasted on it. It don't come from, it just don't look real. And in cases like those, we can say, oh, well, maybe this is really not from the Met Office after all. Then we also analyze the language and the tone. And once again, using the same Met Office thing. If the way in which the communication comes across, the way in which the language is being used, the way it is phrased, if it looks odd when compared to what has been done in the past, then we can kind of step back and have a deeper look because it may very well be fake. Just so we look at the language, we look at the tone. And this also plays out when we talk about spam. So whenever we get some emails and they're purporting to come from these reputable organizations, but when we look at the text, we realize that there are some grammatical errors that should not be there. Then these are cases where we can be concerned and step back and figure out whether or not this thing is actually real. Another thing to do is to analyze the timing and the context of the information. So the timing, sometimes you can just look at the date and you realize that the date is inconsistent with what is being said, what is being put forward. And that can be enough for you to determine that the information is not real. Also, the context in which it is said. And that's why earlier I spoke about, using historical information to assist you in the decision-making process. Because if the context is out, then you know that something is wrong with the information that you're seeing. So how to spot fake news? These are some of the guidelines which have been given. We mentioned a few of them. This one I like especially, where it says that you must read beyond the headline. A lot of things are put out there, especially on social media. They are basically clickbait. They are placed out there with these glamorous headlines simply to draw you in, to get your attention. And whenever you see something like this, you should be extremely careful or extremely critical as to what you're about to consume from an information standpoint. Then you should look at supporting evidence. If the thing is true, then more than likely there are different authoritative sources, authoritative sources, which serve to bolster the claim that has been made. We also need to check our own biases because sometimes we run with a story, not because it is true, but because it aligns with our perception of the world, things that we believe to be true or want to believe is true. So we have to sometimes step back and check our perspective to determine whether or not there are biases there. And finally, we had spoken about the source several times, and it cannot be over emphasized. We need to always consider the source of the information because that plays an important role in determining whether or not the information that we get in is to be believed. And this takes care of Unit 1. Please stay tuned for Unit 2.